the vast majority of us who are gathered in this room on Easter morning come from a background, a family, in which the cross played a part. It was a symbol in the background. And I would posit that even those who were raised Jewish or other, if they were raised in this country, in this culture, the cross was a symbol somewhere in the background, in the consciousness of your life, because we are living in a Judeo-Christian culture. Increasingly, that culture is adding branches. And increasingly, we are becoming a multi-faith country. But certainly, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, as many of you were, this was a predominantly Judeo-Christian culture. And the cross was, if not in the front of your mind, somewhere in the back of your mind, because it was ever present in our culture. I never thought about it much, even though I grew up in a very religious family. I went to church every Sunday of my life from the time I was an infant until I was 18. I don't suppose I missed more than 2 Sundays unless I was very, very sick. It just wasn't done. And then most Wednesdays and most Saturdays with the youth group, of which I was president from the time I was in the 8th grade or something. And by the time I was a senior, remember I was president of the Texas Ecumenical Youth Council, which was the statewide organization of all the youth leaders from Protestant and Catholic and some Jewish homes. And I remember in that capacity, I was invited to go to the Texas-Oklahoma Federation of Temple Youth Conference, which is to say I was the one token Christian with about 300 Jewish kids, all high school juniors and seniors like I was. And I remember the last night of the conference, we had kind of a talent show. And one of the kids got up and told some jokes. And one of the jokes he told was, what were Jesus' last words on the cross? Darn termites. And I remember having had a reaction, something like that. That's kind of funny. But I was well aware of being the only Christian in a room full of Jews. And it was funny, was it, or was it? I mean, can you make fun of the cross? I was thinking, I had spent several years questioning many aspects of my Christian background, but I hadn't actually thought much about the cross itself. Because in mainstream Christianity, the cross, of course, is the representation of new life and new hope and Jesus' sacrifice and willingness to face death on behalf of the others that we might live or something. It's very complicated and depends on which denomination or which sect of Christians you talk to as to exactly what the cross means. But I remember feeling even more confused about 20 years later. I was in about 40, and I was studying at the seminary for the Unity Church at the Unity Village in Kansas City. It's what I call the New Thought Christian Church, a metaphysical Christian church. And within the context of the Unity Seminary, we believe that we're all Christs, that the Christ consciousness is alive in each one of us. And so in the Unity Seminary and in Unity in general, they don't generally display crosses. And I remember hanging out with some prospective minister taking classes at the seminary. I was hanging out with some of the senior students who were almost finished with seminary, and they were having a dinner party, and we were invited to the social gathering. And one of the people was having a birthday, and so someone brought up a big gift wrap package, and suddenly the room burst out in laughter. What's so funny? They opened the package, and inside was a crucifix with Jesus bleeding on the cross. And everybody was laughing because for 3 years or so, this gift was being given from one student to the other for a birthday or a Christmas. And because 3 years earlier, the senior class had gone to Mexico on a trip, and someone had bought this bleeding crucifix as a symbol of everything that Unity didn't believe about the cross. It's a complicated story. I'm just saying I was really confused at that point. That these would-be ministers were studying about Christ in a very inclusive way, but they were laughing about Jesus bleeding on the cross, an image which is very sacred to hundreds of millions across the planet. A very confusing time for me. I remember being very confused by that incident. And as I stand here this morning, there's still some things about the cross and its meaning that are very confusing to me. I personally think of myself as a born-again Christian Buddhist pagan. I happen to believe that the Christ was born in me this morning, as it is every morning, to the extent that I'm willing and open and able to be aware of the Christ consciousness. I'll talk a little bit more of that. And I believe that there's a Buddhist part of me because as a psychologist, I think we're called ever to the now and to simply be with what is without judgment, which I believe is the heart of the Buddhist teachings at some level. And then a pagan because if we're not connected to the earth, then what the heck are we doing here? And if we don't understand that I've got some connection with this planet that gave me birth and that I breathe in and drink every day. Anyway, that's my particular place on the journey. I don't know where you are, but according to this little piece of paper that Michael and Jen cheerfully tabulated for me, you probably fall somewhere in here as being one of those persons who's at least thought once or twice about the cross itself. And so I'd like to say a few more words about it. First of all, begin with the awareness that Christian is a noun as well as an adjective. A Christian is a noun. And at some level, a noun that's in a box called Christian. And that has some beliefs ascribed to it in a relationship with Christ. Noun, Christian, box. Adjective Christian, I believe, can apply to anyone. Because the adjective Christian simply describes a person or a way of being that is of the Christ. So I have no problem being a Christian Buddhist pagan. Again, that's me. I'm not saying anything about what you are or could be or should be. As an adjective, the word Christian invites me to think like the Christ, to be like the Christ, which is to be compassionate and embracing of the other and welcoming to the stranger and willing to think of someone other than myself, at least every once in a while. That's what the Christ calls to me. Now let me talk a little word about the word Christ. Christ comes from the Greek Christos, meaning anointed. Jesus, the Christ, was the name ascribed to who we now call Jesus Christ. But in the Aramaic, his name was Yeshua Christos. Not pronounced exactly like that in Aramaic, but forgive me that. The notion being Jesus the Christ, Yeshua was a fairly common name. Joshua, Jesse, Yeshua, fairly common name. Jeshua the Christ, Jeshua the one who had been anointed as being of spirit. Christos could be applied, was a title, in other words, applied to a number of people back in that day. And possibly in this day, we could speak of Don the Christ. We could speak of Nancy the Christ. We could speak of Rudi the Christ. We could. if one were open and willing to be aware of the anointing of the Spirit, of being called into the present moment, precious moment, to be in deep connection with Spirit. Already I see about a third of the room glazed over, really ready to be done with this. That's okay. I will be in just a couple of minutes, I promise. And again, I want to point out this is just one man's opinion and one man inviting you to think in a new way or in a renewed way about the possibility that you have been called to be on the cross yourself. Not on the cross in the sense of a crucifix, a place where you're to die and to suffer necessarily, but one possible interpretation of the cross, I invite you to consider, is that the horizontal arm represents time, a timeline going from the past to the future, or you might think from the future to the past, but that's a different discussion altogether. In geometry, we speak of the x-axis, right? Measuring time. And the y-axis, the vertical, could be thought of as this moment, inviting you to go deep into this moment. In Greek, there's two kinds of time. There's chronos, that which is measured on a timeline and on a watch. 9 o'clock comes after 8 o'clock and before 10 o'clock. 9 o'clock is here, 8 o'clock is here, 10 o'clock is there. Yesterday is here, today is here, tomorrow is there. Timeline. Chronos, chronological order. Kairos is sacred time. It runs from the eternal deeply into this precious present moment now. And one possible interpretation of the Christ that I'm asking you to consider this moment is the possibility of being fully present in Kairos, grounded in this moment, and ready, willing, and able to think of yourself as being compassionate, willing to consider the needs of others at least as much as you consider the needs of yourself, willing to think in terms of being renewed now, that whatever happened yesterday, whatever might happen tomorrow, in this moment, we're called to a new understanding of being present now. You have any questions about that? I see several puzzled faces. I'm guessing if you do have a question, you're not the only one who has that question in the room. And I promise I don't know the answer to your question, so go ahead and feel free to ask it. That is precisely the point. Thank you very much. The intersection, thank you. The question is, where is the intersection? And when is the intersection? And the intersection can only be in my body in this moment now. That's the point of the Christ. Spirit is everywhere, all-inclusive, everywhere present. It's in every dandelion, every mockingbird, it's in every person. The Christ can only be alive in me or in you, in this body, in this moment. That is a brilliant observation. Thank you so much. That was going to be my punchline after a while, but thanks for bringing it to the fore. The Christ can only be experienced in this moment. Anything else is just a good idea. It's just something somebody taught you, something you read somewhere, something you're going to learn someday. But to the extent that I am called into the fullness of being in this moment, in this body, it is the blending of heaven and earth, past, present, and future, in this body, in this consciousness. Because it is only this body and this consciousness in this moment that can be like a little child that can eat candy that the Easter Bunny brought. It is only in this body, in this moment, from this place of Christ consciousness that I can reach out to the other across the barbed wire, across the border fence, to the hungry mouth, to the naked body, and feed the one who needs clothing and food and shelter. And now, more than ever, at a time where there are increasing walls for more security, and more walls and more guards and more keeping them out there so that we can be safe, it's time when we're called to be not Christians necessarily, but Christ's necessarily. At least that's my Easter story, but I'm sticking to it.